Welcome. Before the world fully understood the meaning of the word genocide, there was a place where ordinary time dissolved into endless roll calls, whispered prayers, and the constant echo of train wheels arriving in the night Auschwitz. Between 1940 and 1945, over 1 million people were imprisoned or murdered here. Yet behind the staggering numbers were individuals, tailors, teachers, musicians, children clutching toys they would soon lose. Prisoners marked days not by calendars, but by survival. One bowl of thin soup, one avoided guard, one more dawn seen through barbed wire. Figures like Anne Frank never arrived here, while others like Elie Wiesel endured and later gave the world words to remember what many could not speak. This video does not only explore history's darkest corridors, it steps, carefully and respectfully, into the prisoner's perspective where hope flickered like a candle in the cold and humanity struggled to breathe behind the fences. They were told to pack. Bring what you can carry, the orders said, warm clothing, food for a few days, valuables, documents. In ghettos across occupied Europe, Jewish families gathered their belongings with trembling hands, stuffing suitcases and bundles with photographs, prayer shawls, bread, a child's favorite toy, a grandmother's ring. Many believed they were being resettled to labor camps in the East, where conditions would be hard but survivable. The Nazi machinery of deception had been carefully designed to maintain this illusion for as long as possible, because compliance was easier to manage than panic. And so, holding tightly to their suitcases and to each other, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children stepped onto trains that would carry them toward the largest killing center the world had ever known. The transports to Auschwitz-Birkenau arrived from virtually every corner of Nazi-occupied and Allied Europe. From Hungary, Greece, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Norway, the geography of deportation was continental in scale. The trains were made up of cattle, cars, or sealed freight wagons, and into each one the SS packed anywhere from 80 to 120 people, sometimes more. There were no seats, no windows that could be opened, no toilets, only a single bucket in the corner that overflowed within hours. The doors were bolted shut from the outside and would not open again until the train reached its destination, a journey that could last anywhere from 1 to several days depending on the point of origin. Transports from Hungary in the spring and summer of 1944, during what became the largest and most rapid deportation operation of the Holocaust, sometimes took 2 to 3 days. Transports from Greece could take over a week. Inside the wagons, the air became suffocating. The stench of urine, excrement, sweat, and vomit was inescapable. People stood pressed against one another with no room to sit or lie down. Infants screamed. The elderly fainted. Some died standing up, their bodies held in place by the crush of those around them. There was no food distribution, no water. Those who had packed provisions shared them until they ran out. Thirst became the most unbearable torment. In the summer months, the heat inside the sealed metal cars was murderous. In winter, the cold seeped through every crack and froze the weakest passengers where they stood. Dr. Miklos Niesli, a Hungarian Jewish physician who would later be forced to work as Josef Mengelé's pathologist inside Auschwitz, recalled in his memoir that by the time his transport arrived, several people in his wagon had already died. The living stood among the dead with nowhere to move them. When the train finally groaned to a halt and the doors were thrown open, the shock of what followed was immediate and overwhelming. Prisoners stumbled out onto a long concrete platform, the infamous ramp at Birkenau, blinded by floodlights if they arrived at night, or squinting in the harsh daylight, gasping for fresh air, is less than #0. 4# is greater than, but there was no time to recover. SS officers and camp guards were already shouting orders in German, a language many of the arrivals did not understand. Dogs barked. Whips cracked. Kapos prisoners who had been assigned supervisory roles shoved the disoriented newcomers into lines. Luggage was to be left on the platform. "You will get it back later," they were told. They never did. The suitcases, carefully packed with the last remnants of their former lives, were hauled away to a section of the camp. The prisoners themselves would later call Canada, a nickname born from the perception of Canada as a land of unimaginable wealth, where teams of inmates sorted the Canada confiscated belongings. Clothing, shoes, eyeglasses, medicines, jewelry, currency, family photographs, children's drawings, all of it was catalogued and either sent back to the Reich for redistribution or hoarded by corrupt SS officers. On the ramp, the selection began. This was the moment that determined, within seconds, who would live and who would die. SS physicians, most notoriously Josef Mengele, who earned the nickname Angel of Death for his chillingly calm demeanor, during the process stood at the head of the line and directed each arriving prisoner with a flick of the hand or a casual gesture of a riding crop. Left or right. One direction led to the labor camp. The other led directly to the gas chambers. The criteria were brutally simple. Anyone who appeared capable of physical labor, generally healthy men and women, between the ages of roughly 15 and 45, was sent to one side. Everyone else, the elderly, the visibly ill, pregnant women, mothers with young children, and nearly all children under the age of 14 was sent to the other. They were told they would be taken to showers and then reunited with their families. Instead, they were marched or trucked to the gas chambers of Crematoria 2, 3, IV, or V at Birkenau, where they were murdered with Zyklon B, a hydrogen cyanide-based pesticide. Most were dead within 20 minutes of stepping off the train. Their bodies were then burned in the adjacent crematoria. During the peak of the Hungarian deportations in May and June of 1944, the killing apparatus at Birkenau operated at such capacity that the crematoria could not keep up, and bodies were burned in open pits that blazed day and night, filling the sky with a sweetish, acrid smoke that hung over the camp like a permanent fog. For those selected for labor, the path forward was not survival in any meaningful sense. It was the beginning of a systematic destruction of identity. Families who had clung to each other through the ghetto, through the transport, through the chaos of the ramp, were now torn apart. Men were separated from women. Children were ripped from their parents' arms. Husbands and wives who had held hands through the cattle car doors looked at each other across the platform for the last time without knowing it was the last time. Many survivors have described this moment as the one that broke something inside them permanently. Lydia Maximovich, who arrived at Auschwitz as a 3-year-old child from Belarus, was pulled from her mother's arms on the ramp. She would not learn the full story of her own arrival until decades later. The separation of families was not an incidental cruelty, it was a deliberate strategy. Isolated individuals are easier to control than family units. A mother will fight for her child. A person alone, disoriented, terrified, and unable to communicate, is far more likely to comply. Those who passed the selection were marched into the camp and subjected to a registration process designed to erase every trace of their former selves. First, they were ordered to undress completely. Naked and shivering, they stood in lines while their heads, faces, and bodies were shaved not gently, but roughly, with dull clippers that tore at the skin. For Orthodox Jewish men, the shaving of beards and sidelocks carried a profound religious violation. For women, the loss of hair was an assault on their sense of self, so deep that many later said they could not recognize each other afterward. Sisters stood face to face and did not know who they were looking at. After the shaving came a crude disinfection process, in which prisoners were doused or sprayed with stinging chemical solutions, followed by a chaotic shower, sometimes with scalding water, sometimes with ice-cold water, and then the distribution of camp uniforms. The clothing was rarely the right size. Prisoners received ill-fitting striped jackets and trousers, or in many cases, simply random civilian clothes taken from previous transports and marked with painted stripes or sewn patches. Shoes were wooden clogs or mismatched pairs that blistered and bloodied the feet within hours. No underwear, no socks. The uniforms were not merely functional, they were instruments of humiliation, designed to make every prisoner look identical, interchangeable, and subhuman. Then came the tattoo. Auschwitz was the only Nazi concentration camp that systematically tattooed its prisoners, a practice that began in 1941 for Soviet prisoners of war and was later extended to all registered inmates. The number was inked onto the left forearm using a metal stamp fitted with interchangeable needles, or later, a single needle. It replaced the prisoner's name in every interaction with the camp bureaucracy. From that moment forward, they were no longer called by the names their parents had given them. They were numbers. Primo Levi, registered as prisoner 174517, wrote in "If this is a man," that the tattoo was the mark of the condemned, a branding that reduced a human being to an entry in a ledger. He described the moment with devastating clarity. "My name is 174517. We have been baptized. We will carry the tattoo on our left arm until we die." For many survivors, the tattoo became the most enduring physical symbol of what had been done to them, a scar they could never remove, a number they could never forget, permanently etched into the skin of people whose captors had tried to convince them, and the world, that they were not people at all. What followed the registration was a disorientation so total that many survivors have struggled to describe it even decades later. Within the span of a few hours, a person who had been a teacher, a merchant, a rabbi, a mother, a violinist, a child with a favorite book, had been stripped of clothing, hair, name, family, and possessions. They stood in a place they did not understand, surrounded by people they did not recognize, unable to comprehend the rules of a world that operated on arbitrary violence and absolute power. The psychological shock was not a side effect of the process, it was the purpose. The SS understood that a person in a state of profound disorientation and terror is a person who will not resist. The dehumanization that began on the ramp and continued through the showers, the shaving, and the tattooing was a carefully engineered collapse of the self, a procedure as deliberate and as calculated as the gas chambers themselves. It did not kill the body. It killed the person inside the body, or at least it tried to. That some prisoners managed to hold on to fragments of who they had been, a whispered prayer, a remembered face, a name spoken only in the mind, remains one of the most remarkable acts of defiance in human history. To wake up in Auschwitz was not to rise from sleep, but to be wrenched from the only mercy the camp offered: a few hours of unconsciousness. Before dawn, usually around 4:30 inches the summer, and 5:30 inches the winter, the shrill blast of a whistle or the screaming of a Blockeltister, the prisoner appointed to oversee each barrack, tore through the darkness. Inmates had minutes to rise, make their bunks with obsessive precision, and rush outside for the ritual that governed the rhythm of camp life more than any other, the roll call, known as appel. It was during these roll calls, standing in rows of 5 on the muddy ground of the assembly square, that the full weight of Auschwitz pressed down on the human body and spirit with its most grinding force. Roll calls could last 1 hour. They could also last 5, 8, or even longer. Prisoners stood at attention regardless of weather, through driving rain, through snow, through the suffocating heat of Polish summers. They stood while SS officers walked the rows, counting, recounting, verifying numbers against lists. If a prisoner had died during the night, the body had to be dragged out and included in the count. If a prisoner had escaped or was missing, the entire camp could be held standing for hours as punishment. In July 1943, a roll call at Birkenau reportedly lasted 19 hours after a prisoner was discovered missing. People collapsed where they stood. Those who fell were beaten, sometimes to death. The roll call was not merely an administrative exercise, it was a demonstration of absolute power, a twice-daily reminder that every prisoner's existence was catalogued, monitored, and owned. After the morning appel came the distribution of what the camp administration referred to as breakfast, though the word is almost obscene in this context. Prisoners received a small portion of what was called coffee, in reality, a dark, bitter liquid made from roasted grain substitutes that contained no actual coffee or sometimes a thin, watery tea. That was all. The midday meal, delivered to labor details wherever they were working, typically consisted of about a liter of soup. The quality varied from watery and nearly devoid of nutrition to occasionally containing small pieces of turnip, potato, or, very rarely, traces of meat. The evening ration was a piece of bread, roughly 300 grams, sometimes accompanied by a thin smear of margarine, a sliver of sausage, or a spoonful of marmalade. The total daily caloric intake for a prisoner in Auschwitz has been estimated by historians at roughly 1,300 to 1,700 calories, far below what the human body requires to sustain itself, especially under conditions of hard physical labor. The result was a slow, relentless starvation that consumed the body from within. Prisoners lost weight at alarming rates. Muscles atrophied. Immune systems collapsed. The camp vernacular had a word for the final stage of this process, Muselman, a term used to describe prisoners who had reached such an advanced state of emaciation and psychological withdrawal that they had become walking dead, hollow-eyed, shuffling figures who no longer responded to beatings, no longer sought food, and who everyone in the camp understood would be dead within days. To become a Muselman was to cross a threshold from which almost no one returned. Hunger dominated every waking thought. It restructured the mind. Survivors have described how food replaced all other desires, all other memories, all other forms of longing. Primo Levi wrote of dreaming about eating and waking to the crushing realization that the dream was not real. Some prisoners risked their lives to steal a potato or a handful of grain from the kitchens or work sites. Others traded the only currencies available in the camp: bread, cigarettes, clothing, information in an underground economy that operated in the margins of the SS's awareness. A piece of bread could buy a warmer jacket. A cigarette could purchase a less brutal work assignment. This informal barter system became a shadow economy of survival, but it also created stark hierarchies among the prisoners themselves. Those who held positions of relative privilege, kapos, Blockältester, members of the Sonderkommando, kitchen workers, clerks in the camp administration, had access to slightly more food, slightly better shelter, and the power to extend or withhold small favors. Some of these prisoner functionaries used their positions to help others. Others became as brutal as the SS, wielding their authority with a cruelty born of desperation and the corrupting nature of power in an environment where moral categories had been obliterated by design. The barracks in which prisoners slept were originally designed as horse stables. At Birkenau, the wooden barracks of the BIIA, BIIB, and other subsections of the camp were modeled on a standard German military stable blueprint intended to house 52 horses. Each one held anywhere from 400 to over 700 human beings. Inmates slept on 3-tiered wooden bunks, each tier shared by multiple people, sometimes 5 or 6, to a level designed for 2. There were no mattresses, only thin straw pallets that quickly became infested with lice, fleas, and other vermin. The straw rotted and was rarely replaced. Blankets were scarce and fought over. In winter, the cold inside the barracks was severe enough to kill. In summer, the heat and the stench of hundreds of unwashed bodies, combined with the nearby latrines, created an atmosphere that survivors have described as nearly unendurable. Sanitation was virtually non-existent. Latrines consisted of long concrete troughs with rows of holes, used by hundreds of prisoners in a matter of minutes during the few designated times they were permitted to relieve themselves. Dysentery, typhus, typhoid fever, and tuberculosis swept through the camp in waves, killing thousands. The lice that infested every surface carried typhus, and delousing procedures when they occurred were more humiliating than effective. Prisoners lived in filth not because they had abandoned any desire for cleanliness, but because the conditions made it physically impossible. Labor was the mechanism by which the camp extracted the last usefulness from a human body before discarding it. The slogan welded onto the iron gate of Auschwitz I, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free, was perhaps the most cynical sentence ever forged in metal. The work did not set anyone free. It killed them. Prisoners were assigned to a vast array of labor details, known as commandos, that ranged from construction and road building to factory work in the industrial plants that surrounded the camp complex. Auschwitz III Monowitz, also known as Buna, was built specifically to serve the IG Farben synthetic rubber and fuel plant, one of the largest industrial operations in Nazi-occupied Europe. Prisoners there worked 12-hour shifts under conditions of extreme physical exertion, exposed to toxic chemicals, without adequate clothing or nutrition. The average life expectancy of a prisoner assigned to heavy labor at Monowitz has been estimated at roughly 3 to 4 months. Other commandos were equally lethal. Prisoners assigned to the gravel pits, the drainage ditches, or the demolition squads endured back-breaking work under constant beatings from Kapos and SS guards. Those who worked in the Effektenlager, the vast sorting warehouses of Canada, had the psychological torment of handling the personal belongings of people who had been gassed hours earlier, but they also had access to hidden food and goods, making it one of the more desirable assignments in the grotesque calculus of camp survival. The Sonderkommando, a special detail of Jewish prisoners forced to operate the gas chambers and crematoria, occupied the most nightmarish position of all. These men, because they were almost exclusively men, removed bodies from the gas chambers, extracted gold teeth, cut hair, and fed corpses into the ovens. They were given better food and housing, but they lived with the knowledge that they would eventually be killed themselves to prevent them from bearing witness. Most Sonderkommando units were liquidated every few months and replaced with new prisoners. Punishments within the camp were frequent, arbitrary, and designed to terrorize not only the victim, but everyone forced to watch. Flogging was common. Prisoners were bent over a wooden frame called a bock and beaten with a leather whip or a wooden stick, receiving 25 strokes or more, while being required to count each one aloud in German. A miscount meant starting over. Other punishments included hanging by the wrists with arms tied behind the back, a method that dislocated both shoulders and left prisoners in agony for hours. Public executions by hanging or shooting were carried out at the roll call square as a spectacle intended to crush any thought of resistance. The punishment cells in Block 11 of Auschwitz, known among prisoners as the death block, contained standing cells so small that 4 prisoners were forced into a space roughly 1 meter square, where they could neither sit nor lie down, spending entire nights on their feet before being sent to work the next morning. Behind the walls of Block 10, a different kind of horror unfolded. SS physician Dr. Joseph Mengele conducted experiments on twins, dwarfs, and people with physical anomalies, subjecting them to injections of unknown substances, surgical procedures without anesthesia, and deliberate infection with diseases, all in the name of pseudoscientific racial research. Dr. Karl Klauberg used Block 10 to develop methods of mass sterilization, injecting caustic substances into the uteruses of Jewish women to destroy their reproductive capacity. Dr. Horst Schumann exposed prisoners to massive doses of radiation aimed at their genitals, causing severe burns, infections, and often death. The camp infirmary, or Krankenbau, was a place most prisoners feared almost as much as the gas chambers. While some prisoner doctors like Dr. Adelaide Hautval, a French Protestant physician who refused to participate in experiments and risked her own life to protect inmates, worked heroically to provide whatever care they could, with almost no medicine or supplies, the infirmary was also a site of selection. SS doctors regularly walked through the wards and selected the sickest patients for transfer to the gas chambers, a process that made reporting illness a potentially fatal decision. And yet, within this machinery of annihilation, human beings found ways to remain human. Acts of resistance took many forms, most of them invisible to the SS. Prisoners smuggled information out of the camp. Members of the underground resistance network within Auschwitz, which included Polish political prisoners and Jewish inmates, managed to transmit reports to the outside world as early as 1941, documenting the killings and conditions. In October 1944, members of the Sonderkommando staged an armed uprising at Crematorium IV, using explosives that had been smuggled in by Jewish women working in the Union munitions factory nearby, among them Rosa Robota, Alla Gertner, Estera Wajblum, and Regina Saphir-Stein, all of whom were later captured, tortured, and publicly hanged. The revolt destroyed Crematorium IV. It was not a military victory, but it was a declaration that even in the deepest circle of hell, the human will to resist had not been entirely extinguished. Solidarity, too, persisted in forms both large and small. Prisoners shared scraps of bread with those who were weaker. They whispered encouragement during roll calls. They told stories, recited poetry, and in some cases, secretly observed religious rituals, celebrating Shabbat with a hidden candle, reciting prayers from memory in the dark. Some survivors credit their survival to a single relationship, a friend, a sibling, a stranger who chose, for no rational reason, to help them at a critical moment. Viktor Frankl, the Viennese psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz and later wrote Man's Search for Meaning, argued that those who found some form of inner purpose, a reason to survive, however small, were more likely to endure than those who lost all sense of meaning. Whether that purpose was the hope of reuniting with a loved one, the determination to bear witness, or simply the refusal to give the captors the satisfaction of their death, it functioned as a fragile but vital thread connecting the prisoner to life. Mental survival in Auschwitz required a constant, exhausting negotiation between awareness and numbness, between remembering who you were and accepting the reality of what you had become. Some prisoners described a psychological splitting, a part of themselves that observed and recorded, while another part went through the motions of obedience and labor. Others spoke of a deliberate effort to preserve small rituals of selfhood, washing one's face in the morning even when the water was filthy, standing upright during roll call not out of obedience but out of defiance, remembering one's own name even when no one in the camp would ever use it. By the winter of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. Soviet forces were advancing steadily from the east, and the leadership of Nazi Germany knew that the vast network of concentration and extermination camps scattered across occupied Europe would soon become undeniable evidence of their crimes. Rather than allow the world to see what they had built, they chose to destroy what they could and move the rest. For the prisoners of Auschwitz, who had already survived conditions designed to kill them, the final chapter of their captivity would prove to be one of the deadliest. On the 17th of January 1945, the SS began the forced evacuation of Auschwitz and its subcamps. Approximately 56,000 prisoners were marched out into the frozen Polish landscape in columns, guarded by armed soldiers with orders to shoot anyone who fell behind. Temperatures plunged well below freezing. Most prisoners wore nothing more than their thin, striped camp uniforms and wooden clogs clothing that offered virtually no protection against the bitter cold. They were given little to no food or water. The routes stretched for dozens of kilometers, often with no clear destination other than westward, away from the Soviets. Thousands collapsed from exhaustion, hypothermia, and starvation along the roads. Those who stumbled, those who paused to rest, those whose bodies simply gave out, were shot where they fell. The roads behind these columns were lined with corpses. Survivors would later recall the sound of gunshots behind them as a constant rhythm, a metronome of death that kept them moving on shattered legs and frozen feet. Primo Levi, the Italian chemist and writer who had survived months in Auschwitz III Monowitz, was among the prisoners too ill to march. He remained behind in the camp infirmary, a decision made not by courage but by typhus. In his memoir, The Truce, he described the eerie silence that settled over the camp after the columns departed, a silence broken only by the groaning of the dying and the howling wind sweeping through the empty barracks. 10 days later, on the 27th of January 1945, soldiers of the Soviet 322nd Rifle Division of the 60th Army of the First Ukrainian Front reached the gates of Auschwitz. What they found there stunned even men who had already witnessed years of brutal warfare. Around 7,000 prisoners remained in the camp complex, almost all of them severely ill, emaciated beyond recognition, or too weak to stand. Soviet military doctors and nurses immediately began triage, but many of the liberated prisoners were beyond saving. Their bodies had been so thoroughly ravaged by starvation, disease, and abuse that even with medical intervention, hundreds continued to die in the days and weeks following liberation. The soldiers also discovered warehouses the SS had not managed to destroy in time. Inside, they found approximately 7,000 kilograms of human hair packed into bags, over 800,000 women's garments, and hundreds of thousands of men's suits and children's clothes, the sorted belongings of those who had been murdered upon arrival. These warehouses became some of the first physical evidence presented to the world of the scale of the genocide. Liberation, however, did not mean freedom, at least not in the way anyone might imagine. For most survivors, the moment the gates opened did not bring joy. It brought confusion, numbness, and a grief so vast it had no edges. Many survivors have described feeling nothing at all. Others recall weeping without understanding why, or wandering aimlessly through the camp because they had nowhere else to go. The world outside the fences had become an abstraction during their imprisonment, and now that they were told they could leave, they found that the world they remembered no longer existed. Their homes had been seized or destroyed. Their families had been murdered. Entire Jewish communities across Eastern Europe, vibrant towns and neighborhoods that had existed for centuries, had been erased completely. The journey home, for those who attempted it, was often a second trauma. Jewish survivors returning to places like Poland, Hungary, and Romania frequently discovered that their homes were occupied by strangers who had no intention of leaving. In some cases, they were met with open hostility. The Kielce pogrom of July 1946, in which Polish townspeople attacked Jewish Holocaust survivors, killing 42 people, became one of the most horrifying examples of the violence that awaited those who tried to reclaim their former lives. For many, there was simply no home to return to. Displaced persons camps, initially set up by the Allied forces across Germany, Austria, and Italy, became a new kind of limbo. Hundreds of thousands of survivors spent months or even years in these camps, waiting for visas, waiting for countries to accept them, waiting to begin lives they could not yet envision. Some eventually emigrated to Palestine, which would become the State of Israel in 1948. Others made their way to the United States, Canada, Australia, or South America. But wherever they went, they carried Auschwitz with them. The physical toll on survivors was staggering. Chronic malnutrition had caused irreversible damage to bones, organs, and immune systems. Many suffered from tuberculosis, cardiac problems, and digestive disorders for the rest of their lives. Women who had been subjected to forced sterilization experiments by doctors like Karl Klauberg and Joseph Mengele were left permanently unable to have children, a cruelty that extended the genocide into the future by denying them the stedinch, families they might have built. But it was the psychological wounds that proved most enduring and most difficult to articulate. Survivors experienced what we now understand as post-traumatic stress disorder, though the term did not enter clinical vocabulary until decades later. Nightmares, flashbacks, paralyzing anxiety, survivor's guilt, and an overwhelming sense of alienation from a world that could not understand what they had endured, these became the invisible architecture of their daily lives. For years, many survivors chose silence. Some did so because the pain was too great to revisit. Others discovered that people simply did not want to listen. The post-war world was eager to rebuild, to move forward, and the testimony of Holocaust survivors was often met with discomfort, disbelief, or impatience. Elie Wiesel, who had survived both Auschwitz and Buchenwald as a teenager, waited 10 years before writing Night, his searing account of the camps. Even then, the manuscript was rejected by numerous publishers before finally being released in 1,956 inches, a Yiddish edition, and later in French, in 1958. It would go on to become one of the most widely read books in the world, but its difficult path to publication speaks volumes about how reluctant post-war society was to confront the full horror of what had happened. Primo Levi published If This Is a Man in 1947, but the first edition sold only 1,500 copies. The world was not yet ready. It was not until the 1960s, particularly after the televised trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961, that public awareness began to shift. The trial, in which survivor after survivor took the stand to recount their experiences, brought the Holocaust into living rooms around the world for the first time. Slowly, the silence began to break. Survivors started speaking in schools, writing memoirs, and recording testimonies. In 1994, Steven Spielberg founded the Shoah Foundation, which undertook the monumental task of recording video testimonies from survivors across the globe. The archive now contains over 55,000 testimonies in 43 languages, preserving voices that might otherwise have been lost to time. Yet the trauma did not stop with those who lived through the camps. Researchers and psychologists have documented what is now known as intergenerational trauma, the transmission of psychological suffering from Holocaust survivors to their children and even their grandchildren. Children of survivors often grew up in homes shaped by unspoken grief, hypervigilance, and emotional absence. Some parents could not speak about their past at all. Others spoke about it constantly, unable to escape its gravity. The children absorbed these patterns, developing their own forms of anxiety, depression, and a complicated relationship with identity and memory. Studies conducted at institutions like Mount Sinai Hospital in New York have even explored epigenetic changes in the children of survivors, suggesting that extreme trauma may leave biological traces that are passed from one generation to the next. The date of January 27, the day Auschwitz was liberated, was designated by the United Nations in 2005 as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. It is observed worldwide as a moment to remember the 6 million Jews and millions of others who were murdered, and to reaffirm the commitment to preventing such atrocities from happening again. But for the survivors and their descendants, remembrance is not confined to a single day on the calendar. It lives in the numbers tattooed on aging forearms, in the names that were never passed down because entire families were wiped out, in the dreams that still wake elderly men and women in the middle of the night, decades after the last crematorium went cold. And so, as the gates of Auschwitz closed each night, life did not truly end. It was suspended in hunger, fear, and fragile hope. Prisoners measured time not by calendars, but by roll calls, by the sound of boots on gravel, by the miracle of surviving one more sunrise. Between 1940 and 1945, millions passed through those barbed wire boundaries, each carrying a name, a story, a world that the camp tried and failed to erase. As survivor Primo Levi once wrote, "Those who deny Auschwitz would be ready to remake it." Remembering their voices is not only history, it is a responsibility. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.